All right, everyone. In this part of the tutorial, I'm going to teach you all how to use Express Validator to validate incoming data for our Express API. The reason why this is important is because sometimes the data that you expect is not the data that you receive. Let's say you want to create a user and save it to a database. So you obviously need a post request to a user's endpoint to create that user. So that post request will expect a request body, and we want to make sure that the username is not over 32 characters of length. Now we are expecting that, but that doesn't mean that the client will send a username that matches our constraints. So you want to make sure that you check to see if the username is 32 characters or less. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, if I'm validating on the client side, let's say if I have a React or Angular project and that project is a form, and when I click on the form button, it will send a post request to my server. Well, if I'm validating that form before I click that button, before I submit that API request, why do I still need to validate on the server side? The reason why is because the API, your Express application, does not know where that data is coming from. You can literally go into the web app, open up the network tab, and inspect where that post request is being sent to, which endpoint it's being sent to. Take that URL and throw it in something like Postman or even the Thunder client that we've been using to make API calls, and send whatever you want and bypass the client-side validation. So you don't know where the data is coming from. So you always need to make sure you are validating it on the server side. In my opinion, I think the server side validation is the most important, more important than the client side, because the server side is where you're actually going to process that data, save it to a database, submit it to another external API, or do whatever you want with it. Okay, so you must always validate on the server side no matter what. So let's go ahead and install Express Validator. So I'm going to type npm i express-validator, just like this. And then I'll run my Express server. Let's go into our code, and we're going to go ahead and import a function from the Express Validator package, just like this. Whoops. So import and then a pair of curly braces. So I'll import the query function, and this is used for validating query parameters. Okay, so there are a bunch of different middleware functions that you can import from Express Validator. And in case if I didn't mention earlier, yes, these functions that you are importing, you are using them as middleware. So what that means is that we're going to be calling them by passing it as an argument to our request methods, such as app.get, for example. And then we want to make sure we're calling them right before our final request handler, which is also a middleware as well. In case if you didn't see the middleware section of this tutorial, definitely check that part out, either in the previous video if you're watching just this Express validation tutorial, or if you're watching the entire thing, just go a few minutes back to where we talked about middleware. Okay, but what I want to do is I want to pass this query function call as if it was a middleware. So we're going to pass as an argument right before I pass this request handler function. So it's pretty easy. We're just going to go ahead and call query and then comma. So we now have 3 arguments for this app.get endpoint right over here. And now what I want to do is I want to specify the query parameter that I want to validate. So I'll just do a simple one. We'll do filter. Okay. And when you call these functions, okay, in this case, we're calling query, it creates a validation chain. So basically, it just basically means that when you call this function, it returns an instance of validation chain. And from here on, you have access to a bunch of methods that you can use to determine what you want to validate. So if you want to validate that filter is a string, you can call this isString method, and this returns an instance of validation chain. So you can call literally the same method as many times as you want. Obviously, you don't want to do that. But the whole point is that you can use this validation chain to perform more validations in order, or it doesn't really matter in this point. But the point is that you can use this validation chain to keep on calling more methods to validate on that single filter field. So let's say you want to validate that filter is a string, and then you also want to make sure, let's see, that is not empty. Okay, so this will ensure that it is a string and it is also not empty. Now I will mention that with query parameters in Express.js, they are always parsed as strings. So even if you pass in a numeric value in the address bar as the query parameter for our filter, or really any query parameter, it's going to be parsed as a string, and you'll see in just a second. So what I'll do right now is this. So I'll make a request. So let me go into my Thunder client right over here, and let's make a GET request to the user's endpoint. And for now, we're not going to pass in the query parameter for filter. I'll click send. And you'll see right over here that nothing happens, although we are expecting an error to occur. Why is that the case? Well, here's the thing. These functions don't actually throw an error. They don't reject the request. You actually have to handle that yourself. So how do we handle that? Well, remember, middlewares are called in sequential order. So this query function that I'm calling, this is going to be the first middleware that we're calling, and then it's going to call the next middleware. So it will call this request handler, which remember is also a middleware as well. So inside our request handler in the function body, we need to take care of the error handling part, because the query function won't throw any errors for you. It will validate the fields, but it just won't throw any errors. So you as a developer needs to handle that yourself. So just very quickly, I want to console log this request object because I want to show you what happens underneath the hood. I know some of you might not be concerned about it, but I want you to also get full context with what is going on instead of just telling you to call all these functions. So what I'll do is I'll make a GET request to this endpoint, and I'm logging that request object, but I want to show you that you can see right over here in the request object, we have this new property that is attached to that request object, and Express Validator attached that themselves. Okay, and it's attached when we call this query function middleware, and then now we can actually see that it's right over here. Okay, and I'll go even further. Let me just copy this part over here and access that direct field and show you even further what that looks like. So you can see we have this context array, or this array of context, and it's an object, and it has a bunch of metadata about the validation. You can see we have fields, locations, errors, okay, a bunch of different stuff. Obviously, you don't have to worry about this, but underneath the hood, what happens is when we call this query middleware function, it's going to go ahead and validate the field for you, and then it will attach the data to this request object. Okay, and from here, what you want to do is you want to call this validation result function. So let me import that from Express Validator. So validation result, that's a function, and you want to call that function, and let's assign the return value to a variable called result. So we're going to call this validation result function, and we want to pass in the request object, okay, just like that. And what this will do is it'll grab that field and it will extract pretty much the validation errors, and you can handle that yourself. So instead of having to manually do that yourself, you can use this validation result to do it for you. That's why they provide this function. So let's go ahead and send a request again. And now you can see that when I log that result object, I now have everything in a proper format. You can see that we have this errors property, which is an array of errors. And you can see that we have two errors. One, we have an invalid value, which I guess makes sense because we are trying to validate if it is a string. And then we're also trying to validate if it is not empty. So we have two different things we're trying to validate. So we have two errors total. So invalid value and an invalid value as well. But if I go ahead and pass in that filter query parameter, and then let's just give it a random value. Let's just do Anson. And now you can see that that errors array is no longer populated with errors because we don't have any errors anymore, because we just pass in that filter value right over here. Of course, if I don't pass in a value, we still will get an error. It says invalid value because we have this not empty call right over here. And you can also take a look at the documentation or in your VS Code. If you just use the dot operator after this not empty call, you can look at all the other methods that you can use to validate your fields. So let's do a validation on the length of the value for filter. So let's use isLength, and then this will take in options. So let's do min character length. We will go ahead and do 3 characters, and then for max, we'll do 10 characters. So now I'm going to go back to my code or my Thunder client. So if I pass in, let's just leave it empty like this. Let's see, we should get 2 errors, okay? If I remove the entire query parameter, we should get 3, because now we're calling 3 functions. We're chaining 3 functions. Let's go ahead and pass in the filter, and let's do an. So an. If I click send, you'll see that we get this error. And now if you actually look at these errors, you're probably starting to feel confused on what is what, you know? So we can actually use this method after we call isLength, called withMessage. You can actually pass in a custom error message, and you can see over here it says it sets the error message for the previous validator. So this withMessage call is going to the message itself that you pass in here will relate for this validator. Okay, so we'll do must be at least 3 to 10 characters. And let's add a custom withMessage call for not empty, so must not be empty. Okay, let's try it out. So if I click send and look at the console, you can see now we have that custom error message. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And if I leave this empty, you can see that we have both of our errors must not be empty and must be at least 3 to 10 characters. So that is good. Okay, so now if I were to pass in just, let's say 5 characters now, we shouldn't get that error anymore, and we don't. But if I exceed 10 characters, it now gives me this error, must be at least 3 to 10 characters. So hopefully this makes sense. So this is how you can validate query parameters. Now let me go ahead and show you how we can validate request bodies, because that's also very important as well. So similar to query parameter, we have this query function for query parameters, but we also have a function to validate request bodies, and that is the body function. And you import that from Express Validator just like this. And it is used the same exact way. So if you understand how to validate the query parameter, you then can validate very easily the request body. So here's what we'll do. We'll go down to our post request for the API/users endpoint, and right before our final request handler, we'll go ahead and call the body function and pass that as an argument into app.post. So it's going to go ahead and call this body middleware function first, and then perform the validation, and then it's going to go ahead and call that next middleware, that final request handler function right over here. And then similar to what we did with the query parameter, in that request handler function, we want to actually use that validation result function to see if there were any errors at all. Okay, so here's what we'll do. So now we'll go ahead and specify what field that we want to validate on the request body. So for the request body, I want to validate the username. And then I also want to verify that it is not empty by calling the not empty function. And I'll use withMessage username cannot be empty. And then I want to make sure that the max is, let's do 32 characters. So isLength. We'll do a min of 5 characters and max of 32. And then withMessage username must be at least 5 characters with a max of 32 characters. And then, let's see. Oh, let's also make sure it's a string. Username must be a string. All right, and let's go ahead and try to make a request, a post request to this endpoint. Whoops. Let me see. Oh, let me go ahead and do this. Before we do the post request, I forgot that we need to go ahead and call that validation result function. So let's do that. Validation result. Okay. So const result equals validation result. And then let's console log result and see what happens. So I'll send this request. Oh, whoops. I'm sorry. I was supposed to pass in request, not result for the validation result. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. That works. Okay, so let's see what the problem is. Okay, so now we can see that username cannot be empty. Username must be at least 5 characters with a max of 32 characters. So we do have our errors, so that's good. Okay, now here's the thing though. I want to validate not just one field, but I want to validate multiple fields as well. I don't want to just validate the username field. Okay, so what we can do is we can actually pass an array of body function calls. So instead of having to pass it in like this, and then pass in another middleware function. Let's say if I wanted to just very quickly validate display name and do not empty like this. Okay. Let me make a request. And you can see now, let me zoom out a little bit. You can see now I have 4 errors all like this. Instead of just passing it individually, like different arguments, we can actually just pass it as an array like this. So we pass in one array, and then it'll call all of these. Not that it will matter all that much, because in the end, it will still validate everything for you. So let's go back to Thunder Client, and we'll send some requests now with some valid data. So let's go to localhost port 2000/API/users, username Anson, display name Anson the dev. And if I look at my console, you can see that we have no errors. The moment that I omit any one of these values, I'm going to get an error in that errors array right over there. So if I omit username, you can see that, yep, we get the errors for username. Okay, that's good. So let's go ahead and customize our logic now, because we obviously don't want to do anything at all when there are errors. In our case, we don't. So we want to make sure that we can actually check to see if there are errors or not on this result object. And to do that, there's actually this isEmpty function, and this returns true or false, and it returns true if there are no errors, and if there are errors, it will return false. So what I can do is I can use an if statement, and I'll just do if there are no errors. So if result is not empty, then I'm going to go ahead and return response. I'm going to set the status to 400, the status code to 400, and I want to send back the errors. So I'll just send an object, an object with the errors property. And to actually get the errors, you can reference result, and then you can just call this array method, and this will just give you all the validation errors as an array, as it says right over here. It gets the validation errors as an array. You can map it if you want to alter what is sent back based on that errors array. You can do that if you want. Let's go ahead and try this out. Okay, so let's omit the display name, and you can see now I get that 400 status code, which means bad request. And that's typical whenever you send an invalid payload. So in this case, we're sending a payload with no display name. And you can see I get the error invalid value, path, display name, location, body. Now, of course, ideally you would want to clean this up because you want to have something that is more understanding to the client so that they understand it very easily. But I'll let you all take care of that. And if I omit the username, you can see now all of the errors. Let me zoom out a little bit. Whoops. You can see now all of the errors appear right over here. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So we're not quite done yet because we still need to actually save the valid data to our quote-unquote database, or our array in this case, of users. Right now we're still using this body object that comes from the request object, and this data can be either valid or invalid, we don't know. Okay, but since we are using Express Validator, we want to make sure that we are using the validated data. Of course, there are different ways that you can handle this. Since at this point we are throwing an error or returning a status code of 400, we can safely assume that the data is valid by just referencing body dot and then whatever field name we want. But instead, what we can do is we can actually use this function called matched data. So let me import that up there. So matched data is imported from Express Validator. And then I'm going to go back down here. And what I can do is I can simply just call, let's do this, const data equals matched data. Okay, and just pass in the request object like this. And then what this will do is it'll grab you all of that data that has been validated. So I'll console log this so you all can see. So let's get the username and let's pass in a display name. So now I can see that I have username and display name right over here. Okay, and this object that is being logged is the matched data return value, which is pretty much the validated data. So I would recommend you to use this data object instead of the request body. So let's just fix that real quick. So let's remove these two lines, and then let's see, we're going to replace this reference of body with data, and I think that's all we need to do. All right, and that is pretty much it. That is how you can validate request bodies for your post requests. And you can do the same thing for put request, for patch request, and really any request method that takes a request body. And since you know how to validate request bodies and also validate query parameters, you should now know how to validate other things too, such as headers, cookies, route parameters. It's all the same thing. Now, very quickly, I wanted to show you all how you can use a schema in Express Validator to make your code look a lot more cleaner, because right now, if I look at this part right over here, I have a bunch of validation going on, and this is just for only 2 fields. And you can imagine if you have a lot of different fields that is being sent to the server, this can start to look more and more cluttered. So we can use a schema to make things look a lot more cleaner. And a schema really just is an object that has all of your validators defined. So instead of having to have all of this being chained after calling each function, all you do is you use this check schema function and you pass in the schema, which is just an object. And then what that function will do is it'll create a list of validation chains. So that way it can just save you a couple lines of code and make it look a lot more readable. So what I'll do is I'll create a new folder called utils, and I'll create a new folder inside this folder, or not inside. I'll create not a folder. I'll create a new file called validation schemas, because I want to keep everything separate. And then what I'll do is I'll create a variable called create user validation schema. I always like to be verbose with my variable names, but it's up to you. And then now what I want to do is I want to define the field that I want to validate. So in this case, I want to validate the username field. So I'm going to use that as a field inside this object, create user validation schema. And then for username, this will be an object, and inside this object is where you will specify what you want to validate. So if I wanted to validate the length, so what you would do is you would just take the name of this method. It's gonna be the same exact thing. So whatever the name of the method is going to be the name of the field that you're going to configure inside this object. So for example, isLength, I'm going to go ahead and type isLength just like this. And so this is going to be an object. And you want to pass in these options. So options, and then it's going to be the same exact thing. You can pass in min and max for options. So min of 5, so this will be a minimum of 5 characters, max of 32 characters. So this is how you can validate the username and its length. Let's do the same thing for the not empty validator. So again, you take the same method name, not empty. You can even just copy and paste it. Whoops, not there. Right over here. Now, since not empty does not have any options, we can just set this to true. But of course, if we did provide options, we could just map this to an object and do the same thing like this, options, like that. Same thing for the isString validator. We don't have any options configured for that. So I can just take the same exact method name and then set its value to true. However, if you did have an error message, like a custom error message like we have over here, we can also specify that as well. So for isLength, inside the isLength object right over here, I can go ahead and specify this error message field like this. And I'll just go ahead and copy this whole string and paste this right over here like that. Now, since not empty does have a custom error message, instead of setting this true, what I'll do is I will provide an object like this, error message, and then that. Okay? And then what we'll also do, same thing for isString. Let's copy that and do this. And of course, since you have this object over here, it pretty much implies that you are going to obviously check for these two validators, so you don't need to worry about the Boolean value anymore. And let's see what else. Okay, yeah, that's pretty much all we need for this. So now to actually use the schema, what we'll do is let's remove all of this. Let me just make sure we have everything. Username. Oh, whoops. That was only for username. Let's do display name. I forgot about that. Display name. And I think the only validation we had was not empty. So let's do not empty. And then we'll just do true for now. Okay. Let me go ahead and remove this whole array. And then now we're just going to call this check schema function. So let me go up top over here and import check schema just like this. And let me go back to the post request. So right over here, we're going to go ahead and call check schema. And then now you're going to pass in that schema definition, which is just this object that we created. So let's import that. So up top over here, we'll import from utils validation schemas, create user validation schema, just like that. And I'll pass that object in here. And let's actually see what happens. So if I go into Thunder Client, let's make a new request to localhost port 3000. Okay, so I am getting an error in the console, and I think it's complaining about the import. I think it's because I'm missing the extension at the end, the .js, but I realized that I am supposed to use .mjs, so let me just quickly fix this and add that .mjs extension at the end, because if I don't have that extension, it's going to throw this error, but if I add that extension at the end, the error will be fixed. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that very quickly. But now, if I were to go back into the Thunder client And let's try to make a post request now. You can see that now I get the errors right over here. It's complaining about the display name, the username, and all of the different errors that's going on with it. If I pass in, let's say, username, and let's do it. Let's say if I pass in just 2 characters for username, you can see that it's going to complain about username must be at least 5 characters with a max of 32 characters. And the other 2 validator errors are not there because we actually provided a value and it is not undefined. So yeah, it's a string and it's not empty. Okay, and then you can see that since we don't have display name, that is not, since we didn't provide that in the request body, the error appears right over here. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you can start to understand how using schemas to validate your request bodies is a lot more easier than just having all of your validators in the same file and just chaining them after each call. Okay, so I would encourage you to do the same thing for this query validation that we did earlier for this GET request. I'll let you all take care of that yourself just for extra practice. So hopefully this all made sense.